Hello and welcome to our mollusk lesson. All right, so we actually learned about mollusks a little bit a couple months ago, and we just barely were getting started when we had to take this little twist in our school year. So I'm actually going to repeat some things, and then after this, it will be all new lessons, new animals, new plants, and other lessons after that. Okay, so bear with this one more time. There's some unfinished business here having to do with this group called the mollusks. If you recall, in the past, we had already done several other animal phyla. We had learned about the phylum Porifera, which are the sponges, the cnidarians, which are the jellyfish, coral, sea anemones, and so on, and then flatworms. And then we were just getting started on mollusks when our school year changed direction. So you will recognize a few of these first slides. So if you take a look here, we've got the objective. Our main job for the day, for the lesson, is to identify characteristics. And as we're doing that, a handful of individual types of mollusks, okay? You might remember this guy right here. We spent actually a full day talking and learning about abalone because it's kind of an important animal in the California coastline. We saw a video of divers harvesting abalone up north of San Francisco a little bit. We also saw, at least some classes, a quick little video on how abalone can be farmed, doing what's called mariculture, a little abalone farm up in Cayucas, California, a couple hundred miles north of us. So that's an abalone. All right, so characteristics that are most common within this group is we have an animal group that is mostly bilateral. And if you remember what that is, that's an animal. If it has bilateral symmetry, you can cut it lengthwise and you get two mirror images. So we would be a great example of that. In this group, the most obvious would be maybe like a squid or an octopus. If you recall, when you see something with two eyes, a lot of times that's a pretty good hint without even looking at the rest of the body that something's got bilateral symmetry. A little harder to see that in something like a snail because it's coiled. But this little sea slug up here, I don't know if you can tell, but with two little antennae up here, you would actually be able to see his bilateral symmetry. As a group, these animals have a soft body. That's actually what the name of the group means. Don't confuse them with worms, who also have a soft body. There's another characteristic that's going to set them apart from the worms. These are the soft-bodied animals. Even if they have a shell, the shell is not their body. For the most part, the group has a complex nervous system, especially the subcategory called the cephalopods, which are the squid and the octopus, and cuttlefish, and something called the nautilus, which I'll show you a shell that I have here in a second. These guys have a very good brain, very good eyes, make choices, so pretty sharp, pretty smart animals with that complex nervous system. And then lastly, you see I put a couple of stars here, they have this body tissue layer called the mantle. And the mantle, if you don't have a shell and you're a mollusk, is this outer, they have an outer tissue layer. So if you're holding, say, like a squid or an octopus, you're actually touching the mantle. If you're holding something by the shell, like that snail or a clam, the mantle would be just inside the shell, and it's actually the body part that created the shell. All right. A few other characteristics as a group, many, not all, have one or two shells. So your typical one-shelled mollusk would be like a snail, whether it be a sea snail or garden snail, something like that, or even that abalone would belong to that snail group. Or two shells, like a clam or mussels that you might see in tide pools along our beaches here, in a rocky tide pool. Self-explanatory, there's always going to be rocks in the tide pool, but along a rocky shoreline. Um, you would find these animals in the ocean, you'd find them in freshwater, and also they're terrestrial, meaning they live on land. But on land, typically in a pretty moist environment. They're pretty delicate. They've got that mantle is a pretty thin tissue layer. They would dry out fairly easily if they weren't in a pretty moist world. Okay, they reproduce sexually, so there are male and female mollusks. And I know you know from prior lessons that's not necessarily true in every animal group. Um, so you have males and females reproducing sexually. Not always do they have to mate, so to speak. What can happen oftentimes is females can lay eggs that are unfertilized, so they would not grow, and a male can actually come by and fertilize those within a certain amount of time after the female has laid those eggs. But males and females. The way that these animals eat as a group. Some, you see there's three or four different ways of eating here. Some are grazers. So when you think of that word grazing, maybe you might think of cattle, horses grazing like on grass. Well, in the same way, slugs and snails and animals in that group will graze using a mouth part called a radula. And I do remember mentioning this in the classroom a while back. If you were to go to an aquarium store and look at a snail, or if you have an aquarium with snails in the tank, and they're on the glass, you'll see this strange little mouth part coming out of their mouth, scraping at the glass. If they were in nature, they would be scraping on a plant or on a rock, dislodging some algae, and getting food that way. So some of them are grazers. Some are filter feeders. So if you think back on how a sponge filter feeds, these guys do it as well, but in a little bit different way. They've got two, here's some clams. They've got what's called an in-current and an ex-current siphon. So water goes in and they filter it through their body inside the shell. And in doing that, they get oxygen, but they also pull out whatever is edible to them. And then the water goes out the ex-current siphon. And so some are filter feeders. So we got grazers, we got filter feeders, and then we have some that are predators. So like a squid, octopus, the cuttlefish, and even some snails, kind of an unlikely predator. This guy will actually climb up on something like a clam, and its radula, that scraping mouth part that I mentioned a second ago, is actually more like a drill in this guy. And what he does is he'll drill into a clam shell and inject a toxin which partially dissolves the clam. Clamshell opens, snail can go in and basically eat the tissues of the clam. So that would be a kind of a slow going, but it's still a predator. Some of the different groups, different kinds. There's a little more technical language. The gastropods. So the snails and the slugs belong to a group called Gastropoda. And actually, following this screencast is another one where I'm in the classroom and I've got some shells of some of these animals. So the gastropods, so snails and slugs belong to the gastropod group. The bivalves, easy way to remember them is typically they have two shells. That's not what the name means though, bi as in bicycle. It's actually referring to the two, if this was a clamshell, it's referring to those two siphons that I just mentioned a second ago, two valves, water going in one and out the other. But they will always have two shells as well. So clams, scallops, oysters, things like that. Okay, so the bivalves. And here's an interesting creature called the chitin. And what's odd about him is he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 little shells that are hinged. Might remind you of a roly-poly bug. And what he's able to do with these hinged plates is he can live on more curved surfaces, like in a tide pool, like on the edge of a rock, whereas a snail, whose shell does not bend, can't live on the edge of a sharp piece of rock or even a sharply curved piece of rock, because that would expose part of his body to predators. So he needs to be on more of a flat surface. But this guy can wrap around little corners of things in a tide pool. And they eat pretty much the same way snails do with that radula, that mouth part. Anyway, it's called a chitin. Technical name, science name, polyplacophora. Many plaques, many plates, referring to the 8 little plates that make up that 8-parted shell. And then this group called the cephalopods. I actually have what's called the chambered nautilus. That's this guy right here. Mrs. Renner and I got this somewhere, and it's a nautilus shell, like you can see in the picture. And when we bought it at the shell store, it had been neatly cut in half, so you can see the little chambers inside. And what these guys will actually do is they can produce gases that fill those chambers, causing him to float. And if he releases those gases, he sinks. So a little bit like a submarine, but a very cool little animal, kind of a squid-like, octopus-like creature that lives inside that shell. And then we got the cuttlefish, which is a very strange animal, and actually that'll be part of an assignment that we work on that we'll talk about later on Zoom. And then octopus and squid and so on. Okay, this is a blue-ringed octopus, which is actually a pretty venomous animal. We don't find them around here, but you'd find something like that in Indonesia. So that's a quick little overview of the mollusks, different kinds, different characteristics, the characteristics they have in common with each other. So we'll talk together soon and get you busy on a little assignment. Okay? All right, we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.